Welcome back to Cryptid Mysterious. Have you ever heard of Bigfoot talking? Or how about a couple Bigfoot having a conversation with each other? Well, that's what we have in today's encounter. Before we get into it, I'd greatly appreciate if you'd hit that subscribe button for me. Let's get into it. Today's sighting comes to us from Ted and Lana Stone, residents of northern Minnesota. My wife and I had driven up from Ely and were spending the weekend at a lodge near Lake One in the Superior National Forest. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the region, this forest consumes an area of about 4 million acres between Lake Superior and the Canadian border. There are nearly 2,000 lakes, rivers, and streams, and if you've never been there, you should make it your business to come. Lake One is part of a series of lakes named 1, 2, 3, and 4. Yes, I know the names aren't very original, but I didn't name them. This is a fantastic area for canoeing and hiking. On this particular weekend, my wife and I were doing the canoe thing. This was in 2012, so it wasn't all that long ago. This series of lakes has a tremendous amount of tributaries and offshoots, so you can really get lost in there. And I mean that in a good way. From Lake 1, there's a short portage into Lake 2, and 2, 3, and 4 are all interconnected bodies of water. At any rate, we were working our way out from the first finger of the lake, which bends around southwards toward the main lake. We were passing through a long and somewhat narrow channel where the scenery was just beautiful. The woods around there are prominently made up of pine, fir, and spruce, with some deciduous trees sprinkled in, like maples and ash. These trees are mostly on low-lying rolling hills, and I believe Eagle Mountain is the highest point, at only 2,300 feet. The point I'm trying to make is that we're not talking about the Rocky Mountains here. To this day, this region is known for fur trapping, which has been going on since the days of the earliest settlers and the Indians that occupied the area before them. My wife and I had been paddling for hours when we decided to nose the canoe into the woods and have a little lunch. There's no such thing as an ugly place to stop here. Everywhere you look is purely pristine and untouched natural beauty. As I begin to tell you what happened here, I want you to know that my wife and I had picked this landing spot in a totally random matter. We had simply paddled to the edge of the lake and found a spot with a slight break in the trees where we could pull the canoe out of the water. Other than that, there was absolutely no rhythm or reason to why we stopped where we did. We slid the canoe up into the woods and looked around for a nice place to sit and relax. As we were snooping around, we came across what looked like the remnants of an old teepee. It was an array of trees leaning against both each other and a main tree, forming what looked like a teepee. But as my wife and I walked around it, we agreed that teepees were not constructed this densely. According to what we had seen and learned, poles of a teepee were more spaced apart, and animal hides are stretched over the openings. We also noticed that some of the trees forming this structure were not that old. In fact, one of them still had living bark on it. By the way, there was no entrance made to get inside of this structure. It was like a tall cage made of trees. As we were mentally absorbing this strange sight, we sat down for a bite to eat. Honey, you take up where I left off and tell them what happened. Well, I'm in total agreement with everything that Ted told you so far. We must have been sitting for half an hour or so when we started to hear some people talking. We couldn't understand what was being said. The two of us exchanged confused looks as we both stood to our feet. As we listened, we couldn't make sense of the words. It felt like standing at the counter of a Chinese restaurant while they're shouting orders in the back to each other. It was both loud and soft in tone at times, and completely and totally unintelligible, like two samurais in an old subtitled movie. The conversation sounded like it was slowly getting nearer to us, so we stepped back to an area where we could watch without being seen until we were willing to be seen. We wanted to see who it was before they saw us. Looking back, we weren't really afraid at the time, but we were a bit apprehensive as to what or who would emerge from the trees, so we waited. The sound of these voices seemed to have started so far away that the source was out of sight. This incessant jabbering went on back and forth between the two parties for at least 20 minutes, but we still couldn't make out a word of what was being said. A short time later, we started to hear what sounded like some limbs cracking, and we could see the tops of some of the trees swaying around about 50 feet away from us. Just after that, we saw two huge figures covered in fur walking to our south, barely visible in the fringe of some pines. We could only make out their shapes and sizes as they walked away from us before being consumed by the surrounding trees. The two of us looked at each other and then slipped back to the canoe and into the lake. As we paddled away into the safety of the lake, we both knew what we had just encountered. Two enormous Bigfoot. But it hadn't really settled in yet. The two of us were almost in a daze. We weren't afraid, just stunned by what we had seen and heard. We didn't get to see that much of them, but we could tell for certain that they were both very tall and extremely thick-bodied. One was following closely behind the other, and between the two, I would estimate their heights being 7 to 9 feet. The lead one was slightly taller than the one that followed it. The wildest thing was their ongoing conversation. It was a distinct back and forth like you and I would have. There is no doubt in my mind that this was a unique and diverse language of some kind. There were a lot of highs and lows in their intonations and an incredible amount of change in the sounds. The two of them were thickly covered in hair. It was not a dense covering, as fur on a raccoon or bear. There was a looseness to it, but it was fairly long. The arms were moving in almost a robotic type of swinging, and the hands hung just below the knees. We both thought that this was very odd. Even though we only saw them walking briefly, we tried to take in every detail. Their leg movements were really weird. We walk with the left and right legs stepping forward on both sides of our body, but their legs seemed kind of wobbly at the knees, and it was like each time a step was taken, the legs would kind of collapse toward the midline of the body. It seemed almost like a crippled movement, and they repeated it over and over again. We saw them from the side as they passed by, but at no point did we see their faces, thank God, and I think I would have died on the spot if we had. After the encounter, the two of us had said that this teepee must have been their home or a marker of some kind, which signals that they live here. I mean, what else could it be in the middle of these woods and in such a random location? The whole thing was terribly frightening, but awesome at the same time. I'm just glad no one got hurt. Well, that's pretty crazy, guys. Another one out of northern Minnesota. Seems like these things are pretty common up there. It's like the northern Minnesota is the Washington State outside of Washington State for Bigfoot. Washington State has the most recorded encounters that I'm aware of, but there are encounters all over the country. I grew up in Minnesota, and I never saw a Bigfoot, and honestly, I don't recall ever hearing anything out of the ordinary either, but truth be told, I wasn't looking for it, and I don't think if I'd have heard some random weird noise in the woods as a kid, I'd have thought twice about what it could be. other than just some animal. Well, thanks again for hanging out. Let me know what you think about this one down in the comments. This was the first testimony that I've heard in a while where they're having a back and forth conversation. I think these things do have some level of intelligence. What are your thoughts? We'll see you in the next one. Oh, and if you've had an encounter with a cryptid or anything else mysterious, shoot me an email. I'd love to hear about it. cryptidmysterious@gmail.com.